Board members, if we can get you to take your seat, we still have a lot of work to do. I'm changing the agenda a little bit. We're going to school fees task force, and then we'll go back back to the agenda. And I am turning the gavel and the mic over to Vice Chair Brittany Cummins because I chaired the task force, and will be reporting to the board.
Okay, we are on item 18, School Fees Task Force Report, and so we'll have Chair Huntsman speak to this report.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair Cummins. It's the view is really nice from here, if you guys are wondering. It's my pleasure to report on the School Fees Task Force and give these recommendations and statutory changes, and there'll be a few motions here. But before we get going, I would, if I could, I'd like to recognize members of the task force, if they could come and introduce themselves real quick. They could grab a mic. We can just kind of come through this and a little bit about, well, who they are and what they do. But we won't get into the details of this, but we'll. Can I bring him up to the mic?
Yes, please.
Okay. You can sit or stand or.
Here we go. I'll sit. It's hard.
Well, we can get enough. Maybe we can get enough chairs around here, and maybe we just all sit up here. But we want to do introductions. So go ahead.
I'm just introducing myself.
Yes.
My name is Tyler Bastian. I am the director of Roots Charter High School, and I was on the task force. And I'm going to give you this chair.
Hello, I'm Alex Goller. I'm a refugee program specialist with the Refugee Services Office, and I was on the task force. I'm also a member of the Access Committee.
Cindy Phillips. I am a member of the State Charter School Board and was asked in that capacity, and also the director of the Wileman School of Discovery.
I am Juliana Christie, a facilitator with Crafted Leadership. Was not a task force member, but the facilitator of the sessions.
It's probably good that they can sit down back there and be comfortable on there. Just a little background of why we were here today. The School Fees Task Force was formed not too long ago by this board. It's a 14-member. We started off 15, but we ended up being 14-member task force group. We have a professional facilitator that you met there. We ended up with. We also had quite a bit of support from the state USBE superintendency, legal counsel. We met 12 times, and we had 4-hour work sessions. So you do the math. Yeah, that's a lot of work. Plus, all of the homework and the due diligence in being very familiar with our rule, statute, and a lot of other information, but it was pretty intense. Okay, The task force comprised of diverse groups. Some of them were here, a total of 14 members. And one of the reasons that we formed this task force is because of some questions and concerns that we had when we had our audit. And based on that audit, we started the task force. And during our task force, OLAG had performed their audit and then brought their audit to the full board, and their findings there played an important role in the recommendations that you see that you'll have coming before you today. Over this past 5 months, there's a lot of work in going through definitions. The rule itself, it's 23 pages long. And I apologize, I think I left my notes in the motel room, but the language in that rule that you'll see in here is unique to our rulemaking. So it's just not an easy read, as some people would like. So it was a lot of work. A little background on this: our first few meetings were going through discovery to why we were there, to learn about the injunction, statute, and rule. Then we dived right into definitions, which was a pretty big ordeal. And then we got into, after we got into the fee portion of it, then we got into fee waivers and everything that was associated with the injunction. So I'm trying not to take a lot of your time here. So as a result of this, it was really important that our goal and objectives was, with this diverse group, make an attempt, our best attempt, in coming up with a draft rule, which is R277-407, for your consideration. We also have recommendations that come from our task force regarding statutory changes. And so there's quite a bit to this, and we can get right into some discussion, or we can go right into our recommendations.
Okay, there are no questions from the board, so if you want to go ahead and go into your recommendations.
Okay, before we get into those recommendations, I want to also remind the board that twice the task force came to the board. One was to create some FTEs that are dedicated to this, and which you took a motion, or you made a decision on, and a motion came before you, and you've started that process. The second part of this was, I think it was in our last board meeting on the flow chart that you see here. And so now we'll get into it.
We did have one light come on, so
Okay.
before you get into the motions. So,
Okay, but
Okay,
let me just
sorry.
go over them real quick, and then we can come back for them. We have several recommendations. One is, or several of them. The first one is, and I'd like to throw these out, and then you guys can come back to them. One is, so you understand the whole context. One is that come from this task force is to have the board have staff request changes to statute or rule in order to give the USBE the authority to suspend an LEA's right to charge fees. An additional recommendation is to seek legislative changes consistent with board rule to update the definition of textbook and statute, amend statute to prohibit schools from charging fees for textbooks except for textbooks for concurrent enrollment or AP courses, and, if necessary, include a provision that fees for concurrent enrollment and AP course textbooks would be waivable. The third recommendation is move that staff seek legislation to create a funding program to support equalizations of fee waivers among schools within a district. The fourth is move that the staff seek changes to legislation/rule to prohibit elementary schools from having prescriptive uniforms. And then the very last will be move that the board direct leadership to move R277-407 to a standing committee for review and recommendations. So that's kind of a lot of hours and a lot of work, and there's some support documents in there with our draft that we created on the rule that's 23 pages, but all these recommendations there's basically 5 of them. And so that's what's come from our task force.
Thank you for your presentation. And so is there a motion, or do you have, Board Member Wright, do you have a question specific to any of these recommendations? You can save it when that motion is before us. So do I understand that these motions are going to come one by one? Is that correct? Okay. Is that all right, Board Member Wright? If you address your question. Okay, so Board Member Lear?
The first recommendation would be, I make a motion, or I move that the staff request changes to board rule or statute as needed in order to give the USBE the authority to suspend an LEA's right to charge fees, or authority to charge fees. Either way.
Okay, the motion before us is to staff request changes to statute and rule in order to give USBE the authority to spend an LEA's right to charge fees. Is there any discussion to that motion?
Just to clarify, Brittany,
Okay,
to statute, or to rule or statute.
to rule or statute?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It did, but we changed it, so it's rule or statute. By consensus.
Okay,
No,
so is there any
three.
discussion to that motion, which is that the staff request changes to statute or rule in order to give the USBE the authority to suspend an LEA's right to charge fees? Okay, Board Member Ellis.
I'm trying to remember the discussion in the task force, but I'm a little confused by the "or," because it seems like we're telling staff like, hey, pick one. And it just seems like we could maybe be a
Okay.
little bit more specific.
Chair Huntsman?
Yeah, if I might comment
Yeah,
on this.
remind
The
me.
idea is to make sure that we have, the USBE has the authority to suspend an LEA's right to charge fees. And if it's already, if our legal and/or the legislature says you already have it and/or
Okay, so that
somehow
was
it's
more
defined.
clarification.
But
Thank
that's
you.
where that's where the "or," why the "or's" in there. And it might be deemed that where it doesn't require the legislature, but.
Maybe it should be an "and/or" in case both need to be changed.
Okay.
Okay, Board Member Wright?
Curious, did our friends at the Utah High School Athletic Association ever comment or give any input on this? Do we have a board member that's still working with them?
With who?
Yes.
Just curious if they had any thoughts or input on
They,
this.
they were not part,
Go ahead, Chair.
okay. No, they were not part of the task force, but we have members of the task force that are familiar with their responsibilities and their piece on accountability on activities and that. But when this goes out, when this goes into committee, they would have every opportunity to weigh in.
Okay, Board Member Stokes?
So when we're speaking of LEAs here, we're also talking about charter schools, right? Okay.
Hey, seeing, Board Member, Vice Chair Ellis?
Sorry, just another point of clarification, and I apologize, being a member of the task force to even ask this, but what about an "and/or"? Is that, can you see a path where we might need to do both, Angie? I will, but I wanted to find out first.
Angie?
Thank you. If it's in statute, we probably won't need to include it in rule, but we'd probably make reference to it. We would, as we describe the corrective action, it's in one of the last two sections, I believe, in this rule, we would then make reference to whatever authority is in statute.
So you don't think we would need an and/or? It would just be a one or the other?
Usually if you say statute or rule, I would assume that means and/or. But if
Okay.
you'd like to do and/or.
No, it's
that's
fine. I
Could
just
be
wanted
both.
to ask you before I.
Okay, Board Member Lear?
And just in response to Elisa's question, my desire, and I think this was reflected in the task force discussion, was to keep the decision-making as close to the board level as possible, so that the board had the greatest amount of authority and to control these concerns.
Board Member Cummins? Lisa Cummins?
Thank you. In light of the knowledge that charters receive a lot less money, has consideration been thought of to maybe add statute of somehow to compensate charters in a way that they can provide those textbooks or those resources? Because I don't know that all of the charters will be able to comply in that regard because of lack of funding.
Board Member Cummins, right now we're just speaking directly to recommendation 1, which is
I'm
our
so
ability,
sorry.
no, it's okay, with our ability to
Well, that's what I'm saying,
suspend-
to suspend an LA's right to charge fees. So
Yeah.
if a charter can,
So this-
violates the rule,
So this would be in reference to the flow chart that we passed at the last
the
board
flow
meeting.
chart. Okay, so is that up on our board docs?
It is in board docs.
Okay.
So is there any further discussion to this item? Seeing none, the motion before us is to request changes to statute or rule in order to give the USBE the authority to suspend an LEA's right to charge fees. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes.
The next motion, I move that staff seek legislative changes, and this says consistent with board rule, but usually we don't have legislative changes made with consistent with board rule, but maybe as necessary, and then there are 3 bullets, and that aren't very complicated. They're on the board too. Update the definition of textbook in statute. Amend, second bullet, amend statute to prohibit schools from charging fees for textbooks, and then our definition of textbooks includes the electronic equivalent, so that would be included by that term, except for textbooks for concurrent enrollment or AP courses. Third bullet, if necessary, include a provision that fees for concurrent enrollment and AP course textbooks would be waivable.
Okay, that's the motion from the committee. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. The motion before us is to move that we seek legislative changes to update the definition of a textbook in statute, amend statute to prohibit schools from charging fees for textbooks except for textbooks for concurrent enrollment or AP courses, and if necessary, to include a provision that fees for concurrent enrollment and AP course textbooks be waivable. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Lisa Cummins?
So now, again, I'll repeat my question. Has there been discussion how charters can make up that fees, or if there's going to be a statute request change where charters can be given provisions to make up that difference, as they are not as well-funded as public charter schools?
Yeah, go ahead.
As public schools, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Traditional schools.
Chair, Vice Chair.
Yes, go
Okay.
ahead.
I think that the first question is, school districts and charter schools, it's not always that charter schools receive less money than district schools. A lot of that depends on the property tax level that a district receives versus the local replacement money that a charter receives. So actually, there are times when a district receives less per pupil than a charter school. But I think to answer your specific question of whether the task force discussed or considered the impact of all of the recommendations in the board rule, as well as the recommendations of the task force on schools in general, not just charter schools, I'd say yes. You'll see in a moment that there is a funding request specific to impacts when you have certain schools within a district who have largely different numbers of fee waiver students. But yes, we did talk about that, and I think that the task force would be supportive of any revenue that comes to all of our public schools to support the costs of either fee waiver students or, for example, with the textbooks, the loss of fees because they can no longer charge for textbooks.
May I follow up, Chair?
Sure.
If staff were to do that and go forward with that request, could it be specific so that we know that money goes directly for this item or those coverages so that, you know, that it's not funneled to other places?
This, when we're done with these recommendations, can I respond?
Yes, please.
Okay, sorry. As the board moves forward with these recommendations, this is a start. There will be updates, whatever ends up with a legislative change when we get to item 4 on a rule, let's see, it's 3, to create a funding program and those mechanisms. The board is still under control of what that evolution is going to look like and compromising in that. This is just to start the discussion on all of those. We, as a task force, we didn't push the water to the end of the row saying we got to have these certain specific items to backfill with guarantees that there's funding to backfill the fee waivers or where a LEA doesn't have the revenue or loses revenue to fund themselves, or they choose to fund themselves, I should say, on textbooks. The way the statute or the way the injunction and that is already in place, we're supposed to kind of already be doing this now. And so we're trying to get more clarity and then also creating mechanism or a pathway to get additional funding. So that's our recommendation.
Okay, Board Member Lisa Cummins.
Thank you. I just was not privy to those conversations, and so that's why I'm asking. You know, it's here in my front of my mind, so I just thank you for that clarification.
Okay.
Okay, seeing no further discussion, the motion before us hasn't changed, so I'm not going to reread it, but it is to move to seek legislative changes for those 3 bulleted items. Is there any further discussion? Then the motion before us is, as stated, sorry. All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Aye. Who's online? Terrell? Okay, thank you, Terrell. Any opposed? Okay, so that motion passes unanimously. Okay, go ahead, Carol.
Motion. I move that staff seek legislation to create a funding program or source, program is fine, to support equalization of fee waivers among schools within a district.
Okay, is there a second? Second. Okay, the motion before us is to move that staff seek legislation to create a funding program to support equalization of fee waivers among schools within a district. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Hanson.
This is confusing to me because can't districts, I know some districts already do this and some don't. And so why are we creating a funding program to help the districts that aren't doing what they should? Why don't we just tell them to do it and have them equalize?
That is a really good question. But it's also came from, if I remember right, our OLAG audit too, that the legislature also participate in this discussion and/or there might be some kind of equalization, something better than what we already have to backfill this. So that's where that recommendation. There was not a lot of time spent on this particular item, but that's what I recall from from our meeting. Do I have something short of that?
Board Member Lear?
Let me add to that a little bit. I think equalization, the word itself is a little like our earlier discussion of dating. What is it? And I think that there are LEAs. It seems obvious, the law says it, do it. But what does equalization mean? Does every school have to be exactly equal? Does it? And certain districts have a greater disparity than others. And certain districts have more fervent booster clubs and fans than others. And so I think this is a much more nuanced and complex discussion than just, well, they should just do it. And I do think to avoid animosity and my way or the highway, that we were looking, the task force making a recommendation was looking for a way to help districts do that without creating, satisfying what the couple of audits have said, but also without creating a very heavy-handed approach by the USB.
Okay, Board Member Wright?
My daughter, for her 8th grade science project, took the data from the Deseret News on how well a school does overall in the sports rankings, and compared that against the data on free and reduced school lunch. There's almost a direct correlation between that. And so we're kidding ourselves to the extent we don't think that that matters. And this is kind of a joke. It's like the New York Yankees playing the Kansas City Royals. You know, a $100 million payroll team against a $20 million payroll team. I think this is absolutely critical. I am so glad you guys had the guts to do this. This will be a battle, I absolutely guarantee. I mean, especially in like Board Member Lear's district where there's massive disparity in economic inequality between certain schools. I mean, extraordinary in Salt Lake City. You have kind of the rich and the poor. And unlike, you know, other places, it's going to be hard, but it's absolutely, these are public schools. You want to go to private schools and, you know, lavish money out, you can't. You can't do this through the public school system and dress it up as, you know, oh, we're a better team than you and have twice the funding. This has got to end. Thank you for your courage on this.
I'm going to interject because I do have a question, because what Board Member Wright is talking about seems different than the request. Because are you talking about new funding that would come in and support equalization? Okay, because this particular recommendation doesn't address small LEAs and charters who carry the burden of equalization independently. Like a small LEA that has 2 schools, they hold that fee waiver burden entirely of themselves, so they wouldn't qualify for this additional funding under this recommendation. Is that correct? Board Member Lear?
Can I respond? These are not fully, these are our recommendations to the board, who ultimately is going to have to make these recommendations, decisions moving to the legislature. So this is not fully fleshed out, but we did have that discussion that there are many, many districts who have only one high school. So equalization is not possible in some small districts that are not particularly well funded. It's also true that there are some charter schools that obviously are a single LEA, and they're not, sometimes they have lots of money, sometimes they're not as well funded. So this is not fully fleshed out, but we're looking for help with equalization so it doesn't cause a lot of discord within a district. An LEA, I should say.
I like this one. Okay, Board Member Ellis?
I just wanted to interject a point of clarification, because these motions, if passed, we're voting not just to adopt the recommendations, but we're moving that the staff seek legislation to create, and so this won't be further fleshed out. The rule would be, but this part, as we're voting on it, if it's written as stated, when we vote, we're pushing this forward. So if it wants to be fully fleshed out, then we need to amend the motion to go to a committee to discuss that. Am I correct or wrong?
That's
I mean, I'm
correct.
okay if I'm wrong, but.
See,
That's- Okay.
can I interject here a little
Yeah,
bit?
go ahead, Chair
And
Huntsman.
Board Member Ellis was on the committee. These are committee recommendations. You can take them, you can modify them, you can.
Right.
But this is what this is what came out, to move this, to move things forward, so it's.
Okay. Yes. thank you.
Sorry, I had a comment. I just,
Okay, go ahead,
Yeah.
Vice Chair Ellis.
sorry, that was just in response because I wanted to make sure we were understanding. If we accept these recommendations as stated, then we are moving forward with the recommendation. So I am, in general, I'm not a fan of the equalization move when we're talking about from district to district, but within a district, we are bound by the injunction and statute to create this equalized program. And so, anyways, that's why you don't think that's right? Anyways, that's what the discussions that we had been having, is that according to what we have been advised, we are supposed to have an equalization with the injunction.
Yeah, the injunctions, Chair, if I might.
Yes, go
Vice Chair.
ahead.
Right.
The
Finish
injunction
that.
already
No, that's
puts
what I'm
it,
saying
we
is
need
the
to have
injunction
better
tells us
clarity
that
and
we
better
have to have-
support, which will be legislature.
Okay, so Board Member Reeby?
As we're talking about this, we are looking, people are mentioning fundraising and fee waivers kind of interchangeably, and those things are not the same. A fee waiver would be something that a child couldn't do because they couldn't afford the fee. When we're talking about equalization, people are bringing up booster clubs, and that's fundraising. I think that while we need to look at having fundraising be not a situation that's going to make one school the Kansas City Royals and the other school the Yankees. I understand that. But I don't think that we should be using these terms kind of interchangeably how we are, because fee waivers really are about allowing people to participate in something that the school is sponsoring. So I think that this is a great recommendation. Thank you.
Board Member Belknap?
Thank you. I was on this task force, and I'm just wondering if maybe I'd like to make an amendment to the verbiage, which means the same thing, but to seek to seek legislation to request funding to offset the cost of fee waivers. That's really what we're seeking here.
No, it's different.
Mhm. Is it, Angie, can you help me?
Okay,
Angie.
sorry, I
Yes.
can't
No, it's
remember your
okay.
title.
So I think the language is different, and you're right. It doesn't speak to that equalization among, I'll just use two schools that are close to us, East and West, because they're easy to say. One's East and one's West. If you had a disparity, let's say you had 40% fee waiver students in one school and 20 in the other, right now the district should be equalizing the impact of that. What Board Member Belknap's language would do almost does the same thing, because if you think about it, if we're providing funding to Salt Lake City School District, that would then go, say, to West, who has more fee waiver eligible students than East. Essentially, we're providing funding to offset the impact of fee waivers, or to reimburse that district for the cost of the fee waivers. So the way that Board Member Belknap just stated it would be to ask staff to work with a legislator on a funding program to reimburse or offset the cost of fee waivers in a school. I think that the same people, the way that you would do a distribution program, you would look at the districts based on the number of fee waiver students, or the students who are eligible for fee waivers. Those who have a higher percentage of fee waiver eligible students would get more money from that program, and those who have lower numbers of students. So essentially the impact would be the same, but now you'd be including a rural district that maybe only has one high school, or a charter school that is a high school that has nobody else to compare with.
Okay, the amendment is to seek legislation to create a funding program to support
To offset.
Offset the impact?
Just offset fee wa,
Cost of fee
I think you
waivers,
can just
or
say,
if there's a better way.
offset fee waivers.
I would say, is it not the, because we're looking at the impact?
Yeah.
Okay, so offset the impact
Well, we're looking
of the fee waivers
Within a district,
with,
or LEA,
Any public school.
or just, or fee waiver. Just,
impact of fee waivers.
thank you.
Okay, so I'll try and restate that. The amendment is to change the motion to say that that staff seek legislation to create a funding program to offset the impact of fee waivers.
Revenue lost.
Of revenue lost
Sorry, thank you. We're just making corrective action here.
from fee waivers. Okay, so that's the amendment before us. Is there any discussion to that amendment?
Still me.
Okay, Board Member Lear?
And I actually like that better. I think this was actually what the task force intended, and I apologize that some of us did not look at this in a more timely way.
Okay. Board Member Hanson, are you speaking to this amendment? Okay, Board Member Hanson?
I like this too because I think it's more broad and it's more inclusive.
Okay. Just one thought I wanted to share on this particular item is, one of the concerns that I heard from the audit were that we're charging too much already in fees. And my fear is if we go down this road and we just say we want to offset the cost, that there won't be that deliberate effort to reduce fees that are being charged by certain programs. And so I guess my concern would be, what is the first step? And then would this be a positive second step if those fees are in a more reasonable place and then we offset it? Because if we're just offsetting it, we don't know what that budget or that request would be. So, Board Member Lear?
And I am certain we would not get funding to offset all of fee waivers. I think we're going to have to, and when I say we, I mean the board is going to have to do both of those things, is going to have to encourage LEAs, take measures to encourage LEAs, and I hope they'll work with us to lower the fees. But I think we're also going to need a funding source right along with that, because I don't think one is going to, they can't go low enough in the beginning, and that we're still going to need a funding source to help encourage LEAs to do this, rather than using it as a carrot, rather than we will beat you into submission by taking away your somethings.
Okay. Board Member Reby?
So this would be a infinite amount of money that we're asking for because we don't have any fee schedules yet. We don't know how much we're going to charge for stuff. So although I'd like to come back and maybe change that language, I think that the language we have right now addresses what we have in place, because until we can determine what's an appropriate fee for each activity we're doing, we're asking for an infinite pool of money. So although I do like the intent of Board Member Belknap's amendment, I think currently we're not really in the position to ask for that infinite amount of money. So if we had a fee schedule first, then we'd have a finite amount of money.
Vice Chair Ellis?
I agree with the sentiments that Board Member Reby is saying, as stated as it's written right now. But once the recommended rule puts in place, I think there's going to be a natural progression where the fees are reduced because of clarification to verbiage in the rule, depending on how the board moves in the end. So maybe maybe timing is of essence, and if this isn't a good time until the rule is put in place, or it doesn't pass, then we need to look at it again after the rule is put in place. So if we take this I'm going to vote to move forward with this, but if it doesn't pass the muster at the legislature right now because the rule won't be in place, then I would like to see us bring it back up later.
Do we have a comment from our AAG? Okay, go.
Although we don't know what fees might be charged this coming fall at the new school year, we do have data on the revenue lost at school districts going back I think, a couple of years. I've got, for example, a spreadsheet from Granite School District, another spreadsheet from Alpine School District that shows the revenue lost amongst the different schools. And you've got one school, for example, that lost $250,000 to waived fees. Another school in the same district lost $100,000. So you can see a discrepancy there of about $150,000, a swing between the school that lost more and the school that lost less. So we do have some data available, and we can request other data.
Okay, Chair Huntsman, or did you have a comment?
Yeah, and there's, let's just kind of get the ball rolling. There's a lot of discussion can happen on how to create additional funding to backfill in this. There's a lot of business administrators, or some superintendents, or some board, LEA board members, there's some legislators that are saying, hey, I think through certain venues there's a way to create additional revenue in taxes and different mechanisms to backfill this. All of this, we're just going to open up this dialogue of what right looks like or what can be doable, but the motion is basically, let's just start that.
Okay.
But we don't know what it is until it gets to the end, so.
Okay, Board Member Hanson?
I appreciate that sentiment, Mark, but I've been here before where task force gave reports and we voted to start things off, and then it ended up going to the legislature saying, this is what the board voted on, and with those specifics, I think we need to be really careful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the amendment before us is to ask staff to seek legislation to create a funding program to support the offset of the impact of lost revenue from fee waivers. Okay, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Then we're back to the original motion, which is to move that staff seek legislation to create a funding program to support the offset of the impact of lost revenue of fee waivers. Okay, is there any further discussion to that motion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes. I'd like to be noted as a no on that one. Yes, go ahead.
The fourth motion, I move that staff seek changes to legislation. In this case, it would have to be legislation, I think, to prohibit elementary schools from having prescriptive school uniforms. We wanted to make clear it was school uniforms, not athletic uniforms.
Second.
Okay, the motion before us is that staff seek changes to legislation or rule to prohibit elementary schools from having prescriptive uniforms. Is there any discussion to that motion, Board Member Stokes?
So this is an interesting discussion because many people send their kids to public school that may have school uniforms, or a charter school may have school uniforms. So you're saying right now that you cannot have school uniforms?
No, can I explain?
Well, I don't know. Let's see if the chair will let you.
Oh, okay.
So are you asking that question, Board Member Stokes?
Yeah, I mean, I want to know that.
Okay, so Board Member Belknap, you have your light on. Did you want to answer that? Oh.
Thank you. Linda asked me that too. I'm not sure that we have the right word yet in prescriptive, but it means that you can still have a navy blue shirt and gray pants or vice versa, but you can't say you have to have a Nike gray shirt. And that's what we mean by prescriptive, that it's a certain one, it's the only one. So. Yeah, I didn't say you couldn't have name brand. So that was one.
Okay, Board Member Wright. Are you? Okay.
Angie, the Utah code already covers .4.
It
I
does.
think, to a large extent. And I think maybe the only thing is we're saying, you can buy it at Old Navy or Gap or, Gucci. But it has, if they say a navy, polo shirt, you can wear like a navy red or a white polo shirt and either tan or navy khakis. You have to give them multiple sources to buy them. You can't say you have to buy it. I'll just say my daughter goes to Challenger preschool. You have to buy it from the Challenger store. You cannot go to Old Navy. Now, Challenger's a private preschool, so they can certainly do that to us. But you're saying, do we have reports of schools doing this? Okay.
Yes.
So you're basically saying the current code would just say, and I think there's already court cases that have established that's the case. So even if they are requiring like Nike or something right now, they could litigate it and probably win. So we're just taking away, court cases and putting them in law,
Yes.
right? Okay, I've talked too much. Talk.
If you don't.
Go ahead,
Could I
Angie.
respond? Yes, you're correct. There is already a statutory provision that states that you may not have prescriptive uniforms. However, that is all it says. And the question is, that we discussed, is whether there should be more direction and criteria, and whether that should be in statute or board rule. And I think the issues you raised, for example, may not require the schools, hand stitched, and it's not hand stitched, but and an insignia on it, so where the logo. Not hand stitched, but embroidered. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. And maybe saying something about may not require a specific brand or something. The question was whether that should belong in statute or rule. And during the discussion, we have no rule currently that talks about school uniforms. All of the provisions that govern LEA school district uniform policies are in statute currently. And people thought it could also help raise awareness, because although there is a requirement in prescriptive, I remember when we used to have Marlise Burns, Jennifer Lambert's predecessor, whose office was very close to mine back when I used to be in Scott's office, so we were very close. And she mentioned that oftentimes charter school parents had contacted the State Charter School Board with complaints about uniforms being too prescriptive or being required to buy a specific kind. And so, and also the injunction, the permanent injunction that we reviewed as part of the task force also states that you can't have prescriptive uniforms. So the issue is just whether we need to bring more attention to that by having it be discussed at the legislative level, where currently all those provisions are only addressed at the legislative level, because we don't currently have a board rule that governs it.
Board Member Lear? Okay. Board Member Vice Chair Ellis?
It's also, correct me if I'm stating this wrong, but in statute that we cannot charge fees for uniforms. And so an elementary school is supposed to be free from any type of school fees. And so if we have any type of school that ever is requiring a prescriptive uniform, then in essence, they would be charging a fee, which is not waivable, is kind of the thinking that we went through.
Okay.
I just
Go ahead,
wanted
Angie.
to clarify that in statute, it states that it is not a fee, meaning it's not that you can't charge a fee, but it's not a fee, therefore what you stated is correct. Uniforms are not fee waivable because of the way that they're dressed in the statute.
Okay, seeing no further Vice Chair Ellis?
So I just wanted that brings me to a point that I'd like to see addressed after we take this vote. So I just wanted to make sure that after we take this vote, there's an opportunity for another motion.
The motion before us then, seeing no further discussion, is that staff seek changes to legislation rule to prohibit elementary schools from having prescriptive uniforms. All in favor say aye.
School.
Okay. Without objection, we'll clarify that motion with school uniforms. Okay, so that's the motion before us, is that the staff will seek changes to legislation or rule to prohibit elementary schools from having prescriptive school uniforms. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, was that Terrell or Jenny?
Carol. That's
Terrell.
Jenny.
And Jenny.
Oh, both.
Were you both an aye?
Yes.
Okay.
I would.
Okay, great. That motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, Board Member Lear? Oh, okay, sorry.
Were you going to?
There's one more motion,
Okay. So, I just wanted to, while we were talking about the uniform discussion, I've had a concern, and it's been brought up in our committee discussions a lot, that we need to define uniform a little bit better, because sometimes, when statute says that a uniform cannot be charged and it's not defined clearly if that is your daily uniform or your other uniforms, that we just, so I move that staff seek further define provisions related to uniforms to be included in board rule, to be considered by a committee, and to look into statute or rule change. So if I can give an example, when we're talking about like to be on student government or something, if there's a required, no, it's like $360 sweater. Right, it's like a $300 sweater. And then if that's not, if that's a requirement to participate, and it's also not can't be considered as a fee, then that's a problem, in my opinion. So I just think we need to move that discussion to a committee. So the motion would be, I move that staff further define provisions related to uniforms to be included in board rule. To be considered by a committee, and if necessary, look into a statute or rule change, but going to committee first.
Okay, is there a second? Second. Okay, the motion before us is that staff will further define the provisions related to uniforms and to be included in board rule to be considered by a committee, and if necessary, look into a statute for rule change. Board Member Lear, do you have a comment on this one?
If you stopped it about halfway through, the staff looked for recommended changes or recommended definition of a school uniform that could be included in board rule, then I'm fine. I don't want to take it. I can't support it. I don't want the legislature to define it. I want the board to define it. Are you up to that change, or?
Well, it's fine if it fits within statute, because statutorily we're required to not charge fees for uniforms.
But we're going to make that first change first, that
Right.
other changes of recommendation first. But that would be changed per the previous motion.
Okay.
We'll see.
So just as a
It's fine,
clarification, the
but-
motion before us previously was only directing to school uniforms, which I understood to be like daily uniforms, not extracurricular uniforms. Is that
more
correct?
That's right,
extracurricular.
but-
And so I believe this motion is speaking towards defining uniforms in general, so that there can be the differentiation between the school uniform, which is in statute, and what an extracurricular uniform would be, and the fees involved in that. Is that
Too
correct?
tired.
Do I
It's-
understand that correctly?
That's not what I was getting at, but that's fine.
Right, so-
Leave the motion as it is, and I'll just vote accordingly, so.
Right. So the question was look into statute if necessary. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Okay, Board Member Hanson.
I think this is a good idea. I think there's all kinds of things that this could include. One of them that I know that happens all the time is that football players are asked to dress up in a suit or something on the day of the game, those kinds of things. And some of them can't afford it. And so I think there's things like that. There's all kinds of things that this could include, so I think it's a good idea.
Okay, seeing no further discussion, the motion before us is to seek changes to legislation, staff further define provisions related to uniforms to be included in board rule, to be considered by a committee, and if necessary, look into a statute or rule change. Okay, all in favor, say aye. Any opposed? No. Okay. Do you need any clarification? Okay, so that motion passes. Okay, Board member, yep, Board Member Lear.
I move that the board direct leadership to send R277-407 as amended to a standing committee for review and recommendations.
Is there a second?
It's dramatically amended, I probably should say.
Okay, the motion before us is that the board direct leadership to send R277-407 to a standing committee for review and recommendations. Is there any discussion to that motion? Okay. Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Okay, thank you to the School Fees Task Force and to all that went into the work behind that, so. Yes, Chair Huntsman.
If I might just remind the board, or I'll ask the chair, so this is our work on this rule. Is it out for the public or presently? And so all of this is released. So there's, if I might just say, this again is draft. There's a lot of concern out there, and there will be when they see this, because there's a lot of clear definitions. There's some direction in this, but again, this is still work in progress. And we already have a rule, just a reminder that we already have a rule that we expect compliance on. And so school fees is not, as we've talked to LEAs and as LEAs talk to us, we still expect compliance to our old rule until these changes move forward. So there's not like there's a pass that nothing's going to happen until we finish this. And so this is, again, on help managing expectations. That's the expectations of being in compliance, and that's what's been shared with the task force, and then also with other LEAs. Would you agree, Superintendent? That's where we're at? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, you're doing a good job up there. You want to take the next one?